So I've been reviewing sports watches from Coros, Garmin, Polar and Suunto for the last couple of months, and all of them seem to be packing in their latest technologies. But which one should you really be buying if you are looking for a new outdoor GPS sports watch, or just wanting to move to a different ecosystem from say Polar or Suunto to Garmin? And to find out, I've extensively tested the Coros Pace Pro, Garmin's Forerunner 265, the Suunto Race S and Polar's Vantage M3 for a couple of months, and in this video I'll compare their designs, their specs, compare their GPS accuracies, their heart rate sensor accuracies against an ECG chest strap, do some real life battery tests and much more, so you can make an informed decision on which outdoor GPS sports watch to buy this year. Before I jump into the detailed comparison, I just wanted to share with you the starting prices for these sports watches. Now the cheapest watches here are the Suunto Race S and the Coros Pace Pro, coming in at $349, with the Forerunner 265 from Garmin being the most expensive one at $449 or £449. Now the Polar Vantage M3 falls somewhere in between all of these watches. Now I've got the larger versions of each of these wearables except the Suunto, where I've got the Race S, or the smaller and newer version, with me in this video. Okay, so let's talk about the design and specs of all of these sports watches, and starting off with the Coros, I found the Pace Pro quite light and comfortable to wear on a daily basis, although it is slightly chunkier than all of the other watches that I'm using. Now the body is primarily made of polymer, which is just hard plastic, and that is also the case for the Garmin Forerunner 265 as well as the Vantage M3. Now speaking of the Vantage M3, the bezel here is made of stainless steel and it just feels really nice and premium, which is also the design option Suunto have gone for with the Race S. Now the casing of the Suunto Race S is also apparently made of plastic, but the finish here is really nice and premium. It almost feels like metal. I mean, if you didn't show me the spec sheet for the Suunto Race S, I would have almost believed that this entirely is made of stainless steel as well. And when it comes to processor speeds, all of these are running some form of a customized chip, but I did find the Coros Pace Pro being the snappiest in terms of speeds, with the Suunto Race S being the laggiest of the bunch. And from a software perspective, I find the Vantage M3 to be the dullest out of the bunch. There is some good use of colors and some animations, but it's not nearly as nice as the Pace Pro or the Race S. Now I find the user interface, the colors, icons and animations on the Garmin Forerunner 265 just a bit more sporty, modern and cohesive when it comes to design. I mean, even after 2 years, just check out how cool the pulsing animations for the accent bars are as I flick between different summaries or glances on the watch. So I really like this design. The displays on all of these watches are AMOLED touchscreens that have been amazing to use outdoors as well as indoors. And the only exception to this bunch has been the Vantage M3, where I honestly felt that the display had a mind of its own. I mean, whenever I raised my arm, the display would come on for a couple of seconds, become dim, brighten up again, and then just turn itself off. It wasn't consistent at all. Now, speaking of displays, all of these except the Coros Pace Pro are using Gorilla Glass, which is scratch resistant, but Coros for some reason have still stuck with mineral glass on the Pace Pro, which is exactly the same technology used in the older Pace 3, and this is going to be a bit inferior compared to the Gorilla Glass on the other watches. So the Forerunner 265 and Vantage M3 have 5 buttons on their sides. The Suunto Race S has 3 and the Pace Pro has 2, and both the Race S and Pace Pro have this digital dial, and I really found the digital dial on the Coros Pace Pro really satisfying to use, whereas the one on the Race S is a bit laggy, and the dial has this slight tension to it whilst rotating it, which I haven't gotten used to as much. Now the buttons on the Polar Vantage M3 are quite recessed within the casing. Hopefully you can see it in the video, and I know that there might be a reason behind this, in the sense that it prevents accidental button presses whilst you're in a race or an event, but I feel like all of the other watches are just doing fine with proper buttons as well as chunkier dials. So this design choice by Polar was, I think, not a really good move for the Vantage M3. One other difference is that the dial on the Pace Pro also acts as an ECG sensor, which is used to facilitate the wellness check on the Pace Pro, whereas none of the other watches here have ECG built in. Now there's 32 gigabytes of internal storage on the Pace Pro, Race S and the Vantage M3, which is way more than the 8 gigabytes on the Forerunner 265. But given the lack of music streaming apps and other third-party apps on all of those other wearables, the usage for the 32 gigabytes of space for most users will be downloading offline maps for outdoor activities. On the Pace Pro, you can still transfer offline MP3 files straight onto the Pace Pro and then stream them to your Bluetooth earbuds, but I'm not really sure how many people are still doing MP3 files today in 2025. And I didn't mention offline maps here for the Forerunner 265 because there aren't any, which is a shame given it's $449. You can still transfer courses and navigation routes from the Garmin Connect app to the Forerunner 265, but they're just going to be these pink squiggly breadcrumb lines with navigational directions rather than full-blown outdoor maps like on the Pace Pro, the Race S and the Vantage M3. Now all watches have 5 atmospheres of water resistance, which is equivalent to around 50 meters of water depth. And finally, at the back of all of these watches, you've got the proprietary suite of sensors from each manufacturer, and we'll be looking at the heart rate sensor accuracies of all of these sports watches later on in this video. Okay, so let's move on to the comparisons in health, performance and recovery tracking. Now, being outdoor GPS sports watches, these things are not just limited to loads of outdoor activities, but also have a few indoor training activities built in. All watches also have multi-sports like triathlons built in, and you can also create your own custom multi-sport here. Now, if you're into running, all of these watches provide quite a lot of useful metrics on top of your usual pace chart, heart rate chart and cadence chart. So for example, you'll get things like pace, heart rate, running power, efficiency, elevation, cadence, stride length and trailing effect on the Coros, Suunto and Polar watches. But the Garmin Forerunner 265 really charges ahead with additional running dynamics than all of these other watches. So on top of the metrics that I just mentioned, the Forerunner 265 will show something known as a grade adjusted pace, performance condition, which is a real-time assessment of your ability to perform, vertical ratio and vertical oscillation, ground contact time, temperature, run walk time, speed and sweat loss. Now all of this data might be useful to you, maybe it's not, but it's available here on the 265 whether you want it or not. But for something like vertical oscillation, for example, if I wanted to improve on that, I can get that information from the Forerunner 265, whereas I wouldn't even know about that from any of the other watches that I'm showing you here. Now the performance and recovery metrics are also largely similar on all of these watches, but presented slightly differently. Now on the Forerunner 265 and the Vantage M3, the training status feature goes a bit deeper into details compared to the Suunto and Coros watches. By tracking the acute and chronic loads, and the training readiness feature on the Forerunner 265, for me at least, has been really useful in understanding whether I'm actually ready to take on my next intense activity. Now there's also metrics like heart rate variability, sleep tracking, stress tracking and so on to manage your recovery on all of these watches. Now one key difference between these is that the Forerunner 265, you get a daily well-being feedback on how your day went, and the watch will then recommend whether to take it easy, rest, recover or focus on more intense activities tomorrow, which again adds to the feeling that the Forerunner 265 and the software behind it is kind of alive, just constantly monitoring you and analyzing all of the metrics it's gathering throughout the day. Now on most days, the sleep data on all of these watches were fairly consistent. Now I did sometimes feel that the Pace Pro misunderstood me lying in bed as the starting time for my sleep. Like here for example, I was in bed watching something on Apple TV at around 10:30 at night, but the Pace Pro thought I was already asleep, whereas the Forerunner 265, the Race S and the Vantage M3 knew I wasn't really sleeping and picked up the correct sleep start time at around midnight. So from a health, performance and recovery perspective, I think all of these watches are largely comparable to each other, and I think you'd be generally happy with either of these options. But special mention to the Garmin Forerunner 265 as it just edges ahead of the competition with the wealth of data coming out of the watch as well as from the app. Okay, so let's move on to the smart functionalities of all of these sports watches. So on the Pace Pro and the Vantage M3, you can receive notifications from your phone, but you can't really reply to anything, not even preset messages like you can on the Forerunner 265 and the Race S watches here. Now, all watches have some form of a weather app, a music app that you can use with your paired Bluetooth headphone. There's a camera app on the Pace Pro here that you can pair with the GoPro or Insta360 camera, as well as things like compass, barometers, and altimeters. Like I said, on the Forerunner 265, there's a bunch of music streaming apps, as well as third-party apps that can be downloaded straight to the watch, but this is lacking on the Pace Pro as well as on the Race S and the Vantage M3. Oh, and one other thing is that the Forerunner 265 also has Garmin Pay, so you can use NFC to pay for things after your long training session without having to take your credit card or phone with you, which again is absent from all of the other watches I'm showing you here. So overall, none of these are full-blown smartwatches, but the Forerunner 265 from Garmin has a few additional smart features which might be important to you. Okay, so let's compare the heart rate sensor accuracies of all of these sports watches. Now, I've been using Polar's H10 ECG chest strap to benchmark my heart rate readings, and this is often considered as the gold standard for heart rate measurement. Now, looking at one of my runs here, the Forerunner 265, the Pace Pro, and the Vantage M3 have performed really well and are almost in sync with the chest strap for almost the entire run. The exception here being the Suunto Race S with the black lines that you see on the chart, where it was struggling to keep up with the rest of the watches as well as the chest strap. So really happy with the Garmin, Coros, and Polar watches here for outdoor runs, but are still a bit suspicious with the Suunto Race S. Now, moving on to strength training, this is where I find most wrist-based optical heart rate sensors start to struggle because of quite a lot of movements between the arms, the wrists, as well as flexions in the muscles. And looking at the heart rate chart here, the Forerunner 265, the Vantage M3, and the Pace Pro were almost in sync with each other and not far off from the chest strap, except for a couple of areas where the three of these struggled. Now, it's quite obvious from the chart again with the black lines that the Race S is struggling a fair bit. So the other watches were fine, but I was still a bit puzzled as to why the Suunto Race S was performing the way it was. So I ran a few additional tests specifically for the Race S, and this time on a Peloton bike, which is one of the easiest activities for any smartwatch or sports watch to track and record. And at the start, again, it looked like the Race S was struggling to keep up with the Forerunner 265 and the Vantage M3. So I decided to switch arms and move the Race S way above on my left arm where I normally wouldn't wear any of these watches, and the Race S finally started to perform in line with the Forerunner 265 and the Vantage M3. I mean, I don't know why the Race S needs to be that far up my arm. In all of the tests that I have been running, the Race S has been roughly 2 to 3 fingers away from my wrist bone. So I went for a final outdoor run with the Suunto Race S, and you can see the results are a bit better now against the chest strap, but it's still quite noisy in certain areas and nowhere as accurate as the other three watches have been performing. Overall, the heart rate sensor accuracies on the Forerunner 265, the Coros Pace Pro, and the Polar Vantage M3 are really good for all sorts of workouts, except the Suunto Race S, where I did have some issues with it. Okay, so let's quickly look at the GPS accuracies of these watches. Now, all of these have dual frequency antennas that can latch onto multiple satellite systems for location tracking when outdoors. And for all of my runs, the distances measured by all of these watches, as well as the average paces, have been consistently similar, which is great news, and you can see these examples on the screen just now. It's just that occasionally the Vantage M3 overestimated the average pace compared to the other three, but it's such a small deviation in the grand scheme of things. Okay, so looking at the map here for one of my runs, all watches except the Vantage M3 caught my location fairly quickly, and they all did fairly well tracking my location, including the correct side of the roads that I used throughout the run. Now, the Vantage M3 and the Pace Pro was sometimes a bit off when I was running under some tree coverage, but after I went into the city, they all stayed locked onto me solidly, and there were quite a lot of nuanced turns on this route, which all of them have picked up really well. You can really see the dual frequency antennas doing their jobs, as they've picked up even parts where I crossed roads accurately. Now overall, I think that the GPS accuracies on all of these watches are fairly good, and you can't go wrong with either of these. But if I was to absolutely rank them in terms of accuracies, I'd say that the Suunto and Garmin would be at the top, followed by the Coros Pace Pro, and then the Vantage M3. Okay, so let's move on to battery tests. The Pace Pro is claimed to last for up to 20 days in smartwatch mode and 31 hours in dual frequency mode, which is more than the other options here. And in my testing, the Pace Pro, unsurprisingly, lost the least amount of battery every night whilst I was sleeping, as well as when I was working out. I'll show you the results here. The Forerunner 265 was the worst performer here. Again, not a surprise given its battery spec, where I averaged around 7 days, followed by the Race S, where I averaged between 7 and 7.5 days, followed by the Vantage M3, which lasted for just above 7.5 days, and finally the Pace Pro, which lasted for around 14 days on a single charge, which is really impressive. And considering the durations I use these for outdoor GPS workouts, the Pace Pro could last for around 24.5 hours in dual frequency mode, followed by just over 18 hours on the Vantage M3, 16 hours on the Race S, and finally 14.5 hours on the Forerunner 265. Now, if you're participating in a really long event, all of these watches have some form of an eco mode or a battery saver mode that can help them last even longer with the GPS turned on, but the dual frequency mode will be switched off for all of those battery saver modes or eco modes. Okay, so let's quickly talk about the apps for all of these watches, and starting off with the Coros and Garmin apps. The interface of both of these apps is intuitive, and they show you all of the health, performance and recovery metrics measured by the Pace Pro and the Forerunner 265 in a bit more detail. Now, the interface of the Garmin Connect app has been updated recently, and it shows you your races, events, as well as Garmin coach plans very clearly. Now, the Polar Flow app for the Vantage M3 presents again all of the health and performance metrics in quite a lot of detail. It's just a bit clunky and difficult to navigate around. And although I appreciate that the main page shows you your today's activities and stats in these really simple tiles, the information within these tiles can get overwhelming very quickly, and there's all sorts of shortcuts here that might not be apparent at first. Now, I do want to give Suunto a big shout out for making their app a bit different, and I think pretty and clean are probably two words that come to my mind when I want to describe the Suunto app. It's got this top section here that shows you your core metrics with any activities in the bottom half of the app. Now, looking at activity data in the Coros and Garmin Connect apps, these are presented really well. Take this outdoor run for example. Both apps show a map of my route, quite a lot of stats and charts for metrics, and like I mentioned, the Garmin will give you a bit more detail here in the app when it comes to running dynamics. The Polar Flow app also gives a fair amount of information, but not nearly as many charts as Coros and Garmin Connect apps. The Suunto app again presents data in this clean format, and one awesome thing about activities in the Suunto app is that you can play them and see yourself on the map against any metric you want to analyze. See, the most simple example could be assessing the impact on your pace whilst you're running uphill. I mean, sure, you can log into the Garmin Connect and Polar Flow web versions to view something like this on your computer, but it's not readily available like it is on the Suunto app. Now, there's a ton of additional features in the Garmin Connect and Coros apps, including things like a muscle heat map, automatic strength training detection, large databases of workouts if you're feeling lost and need some inspiration. Now, the Polar Flow and Suunto apps don't have a library of workouts like Coros and Garmin do, but at least in the Polar Flow web version, you can sign up to training programs and then import that into the Polar Flow app. But the Suunto app really struggles in this department. One difference I've found is that on the Garmin Connect app, I can actually ask the app to create a route by itself by just setting a distance, which saves me a fair amount of time if I want to try a new route. But in all of the other apps, I either have to create my own route from scratch or import one as a GPX file. Now, one of the best things across all of these apps is that there's no monthly subscription or paywalls to access any features. They're all completely free to all users. So then, which one of these is the best outdoor GPS sports watch? Now, if you wanted the cheapest out of the bunch, get the Coros Pace Pro. Although the Suunto Race S costs the same at $349 US, the Pace Pro is just a better performer in almost all areas. If you want the best battery, again, get the Pace Pro. For the best heart rate sensor accuracy, get the Garmin Forerunner 265 or the Coros Pace Pro. The Polar Vantage M3 being an alternative. For better GPS accuracy, either get the Garmin Forerunner 265 or the Suunto Race S, with the Coros Pace Pro being a close alternative. Now, for detailed performance metrics and advanced dynamics for runners, get the Garmin Forerunner 265. That is a clear winner out of the bunch, with the Coros Pace Pro being an alternative. For the best offline maps, the Pace Pro has a better implementation, with the Suunto Race S and Polar Vantage M3 being alternatives. Now, for more smart features, better user interface, graphics, animation and software, Garmin again is a clear winner with the Forerunner 265, with the Coros Pace Pro being a really close alternative. So hopefully by using that table, you can now choose a sports watch by considering factors that matter most to you. But if you were to hand me $450 US today and ask me to pick one sports watch out of these four, I would either go for the Garmin Forerunner 265 or the Coros Pace Pro. Quite probably the Coros Pace Pro actually, because at $349 US, it presents amazing value for money for what it's giving you, and it's performed really well in almost everything I've thrown at it over the last couple of months. Alright, as always, I just wanted to say thanks to all of you amazing subscribers, and to new viewers, don't be shy from pressing that subscribe button, especially if you don't want to miss out on my deep dive on the all new Garmin Instinct 3 and more videos on smart rings, including the Oura Ring 4 and some of its new competitors. See you in the next one.